My name is Rachel Van Campenhout. I'm the Learning Science Specialist here at Acrobatic by VitalSource. Today we're going to be going through a presentation about a data-driven perspective, increasing outcomes by increasing engagement. And with me is Benny Johnson.
Everybody, thanks for joining. I'm the Director of R&D at Acrobatic by VitalSource. So Rachel and I work together, and we hope you enjoy and get a lot out of what we have to show you today. And I'll just add, second what Rachel said, we hope you have lots of questions, so don't be shy.
Okay, so the main topic of what we're kind of going to go through is founded on some learning science principles that our courseware platform is based on. And this is called the Doer Effect. And the Doer Effect is a learning science principle that says that the amount of interactive practice a student does, which means like formative practice questions, is more predictive of learning than the amount of passive reading or video watching that a student does. And in fact, the research has found that doing practice has 6 times the effect size of reading alone. Now, this research was originally done out of Carnegie Mellon University. Ken Katinger and colleagues did an investigation, and they used thousands of students who participated in a MOOC, a massive open online course, as well as paired with the Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative, their course, which had all of that interactive practice. And they were able to study the data that they collected and found that the students who chose to engage in the practice had much higher learning outcomes than those who only did things like reading or watching the videos. Now, Ken Katinger followed up with another study that used a statistical design, which showed that doing formative practice actually caused better learning. They were able to study causality. And causality is really important when we're thinking about this principle, because we want to make sure that this isn't attributed to an external variable, some third variable. For example, we all know that there are students who are they're great students. They get in, they do their work early, they do all the practice, they get, good grades. And are we sure that doing practice wasn't just also a byproduct of generally being good at the subject or having a high level of motivation? And the statistical model that Ken Katinger put together was able to show that and isolate that doing the practice did in fact cause better learning outcomes. And here at Acrobatic, we've been able to replicate those findings using our own data sets as well.
I'd like to add that we can't overemphasize the importance of the causality finding that Rachel's talking about. The fact that better grades correlate with doing more practice is no surprise. We've known that since the beginning of practice and grades, probably, right? But it's another thing, as Rachel has pointed out, to say that the practice is driving the grades. And it's not often that you're able to show a causal relationship in an educational experiment. There's plenty of correlational ones, and that's fine. Usually that's the most you can do from the kind of data that you have available and the kind of study you're able to do. But since that we know that the Doer effect is causal, that means we can be confident in recommending more practice to students as a best practice that will actually increase learning outcomes. If the relationship between practice and outcomes were merely correlational, for example, then recommending more practice wouldn't drive up grades. But since that we know that it is, then we can be confident in that recommendation. And we've studied this in a lot of different contexts, different kinds of courses, different institutions, and we're doing more all the time because it's important to show that there's that generalizability of the causality of the Doer effect. But we are getting a larger and larger body of evidence all the time on that. And I think it's very clear now that recommending this practice is a good thing to do. And the type of practice that we have in the acrobatic courseware, well, you do questions at the end of the chapter, right? Well, that's practice. Sure, it is. And that's good. It's good to do that. But the way that our courses are designed, but are to give you practice as you're reading. And the idea from that, just a motivation for why the Doer Effect might work, is if you're asked some comprehension questions as you go, as you're reading the material, then that, for one, guards against you just tuning out and passively reading. We've all done it, even if you don't mean to. Sometimes you can't help it. So these questions don't have to be special in that they must be carefully designed for the Doer Effect or you won't get it. In all the courses where we've observed the Doer Effect, subject matter experts were writing the questions, just doing what they normally do. They weren't, to our knowledge, aware of this work or doing anything special that they wouldn't do otherwise in designing their courses.
So because we know how important doing that formative practice is for learning outcomes, that brings us to engagement with them, right? Students won't receive any benefit if they don't do them. So what we're actually looking at here, this graph, this is an internal graph that we'll look at when we look at a course, right? And so what you're seeing is along the x-axis, we're seeing page visits. So each page of the course is going to go sequentially from page 0 to, in this course, including all of the, reference material at the end, is 250 pages. And along the y-axis are your students. So this is a smaller class, there's 30 plus students who started this section. And the different colored dots we're going to see are 4 different components of the courseware that we're tracking. And so for every page, you can see there's a red dot and a blue dot. Those are the ones we're going to focus on. The blue dots are your page visits, and your red dots are engagement with formative practice. And so we call these engagement graphs. And so this is showing us, are there students who are doing practice and students who are going and reading the pages but not doing any practice? So there's sometimes a delta between those two numbers, right? You might have a few students who are going in and they might be reading the content, but they're not engaging in that formative practice. And this is something that we take a look at it and we try and figure out what can we do to help close that gap, that reading doing gap that we're seeing, right? Because we want all students to engage with that formative practice because we know that it's good for their learning. So we have here an example of 4 different graphs. Now, what we're looking at is the same exact course. This is a statistics course, and this was part of a grant-funded initiative. And we have 4 different institutions, 4 different instructors, and they were all part of the same grant initiative. And they have the same exact course. They had training on how to use it, the learning dashboards, all those other things that come along with the course, instructor resources. And yet you can see we have very different looking engagement graphs. And once we were able to take a look at this actually surprised a number of people. But what this came down to was different methods of implementing the courseware within your individual class. And so this really went to show just how critical instructors are in the implementation of any technology tool. In this case, it's the courseware. And you can see that there's widely variable levels of reading and doing in different patterns here. So, up here in this top one, we see a pretty close relationship here, a slight downward trend, which is it's typical of a class. There tends to be some depreciation towards the end of a semester. Then we have up in this, top right, we see dramatic, up and down patterns. So we're losing a significant number of students as they work through, a module, but then they pop back up for the next one, right? And then, down here at the bottom, we have a smaller class and they all stick with it, halfway through, and then you lose, one student who stopped doing the work, but they were all doing almost everything. So, this is really quite a valuable lesson for us that it's the tool can do quite a lot, and we know that formative practice is incredibly valuable for students, and we can build it in, and yet there's so much that instructors can do to help leverage what the tool can do and help students as they learn.
So yeah, another point that I think Rachel's made this point, but can't be emphasized too much, is that again, all these four graphs are showing engagement from the exact same courseware, different courses, different instructors, but it's the same courseware. So this is a probability and statistics course. And we don't even have to get into the details of what the patterns of these engagement dots mean. We can, and Rachel is, and it's very fascinating. But if all we do is just recognize that these four graphs look qualitatively different, right? This is measuring engagement in various ways, and the higher the dots are on the y-axis, the more engagement you've got. They're totally different looking, yet they're for the same course. And so if it's the same course, what's the variable? Well, the variable is the instructional context, right? And as Rachel said, that matters greatly. And probably the biggest variable in that instructional context is the instructor. And so I would say that's a reason for optimism, because we know that instructors can affect engagement tremendously by simple things, just like making certain things in the courseware part of the grade, right? We're going to require that you do the quizzes for a grade. That's one way. It's not the only way. Why does this matter? Well, we just talked about how that the Doer effect is causal. If we do more practice, then we get better outcomes because the practice causes better outcomes. And so that's a lever that can be used to improve outcomes that can easily be incentivized by the instructor. It doesn't require much to incentivize the doing. For example, just make it part of the grade. And I don't mean just we have to score it like we'll do the quiz and the score on the quiz counts for party grade. You can do that. That's not hard to do, but it can be even simpler. Let's just give you a participation score for doing the practice that goes along the way. Because as Rachel pointed out, sometimes students will read the text, but they won't do the practice. Well, that's a shame, because we know the practice helps them get better outcomes. And we've looked at a lot of these engagement graphs, and we see it time and again. Not everything, of course, can be explained by instructors' policies and practices, but a whole lot of it can. And you always can tell if something's required because those dots will right up near the top. So for example, the graph at the top right, we see the green dots, which has to do with the summative assessment. And I believe all these instructors require them. You can easily see it in the top right graph. The green dots are higher than the other dots. In fact, they're even higher than the blue dots, which means sometimes students are taking the quiz and not even reading the courseware. I don't know in this case, but it's possible that this was not the only instructional resource that's used. It's not always, but it makes the point that, and I think we all know this, if there's points attached to it, they'll do it. If there are not, then you'll get a lot less engagement. And so that's an easy lever that can be pulled to do things that research shows get you better grades, like the formative practice, which are the red dots on these plots.
Great, and that's a perfect segue into this next portion. Um, Improving engagement, knowing what we know, what can we do to help students get the most out of, the doer effect, doing practice, getting better outcomes. One of those things, as Benny was just mentioning, is assigning points, even if it's just participation, right? That little bit of motivation will help students say, you know what, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this. Another thing, we have the benefit of actionable data. So using learning dashboards, instructors can identify students who are struggling, very early on, students who maybe aren't doing all of the practice, being able to track your students in real time is a wonderful feature that is really reshaping what instructors are able to do in terms of monitoring their students and reaching out very early on in the semester. But even, something more, kind of ground setting is something I've heard from many instructors who are using our courseware is setting early expectations. And really in the first couple of weeks of a course, helping students to understand what the value of the formative practice is, helping them understand that it will help them learn, it will help them get better outcomes if they engage in it and continue to engage throughout the course. Helping them to understand what you expect out of your students and getting students into habits that are good for them very early in a semester. And then, even some socializing aspects have been, some instructors have found to be really helpful. Either discussing individual, examples of formative practice and taking a look maybe at what your class data looks like for that, anonymously, of course, or, kind of talking about where you see your students through data and helping them to understand that as an instructor, you are being able to monitor them. You can um, look for patterns, look for trends that you think you should bring up to your students, and kind of bring them in as part of that conversation. And strategies, of course, are going to be variable depending on what your teaching situation is. Do you have a class of 25? Do you have a class of 250? Depending on what you're teaching, what class size you're dealing with. Are you entirely online? Are you asynchronous? Are you synchronous? So we know right now, especially, there's a lot of fluctuation in teaching and how instructors are, having to adapt very quickly to changing situations. So keeping things in mind that are good for your students, no matter how they're learning, doing practice is good for them in any situation, and trying to focus in on something simple that you can do to encourage students to do that practice as their learning material is an incredibly valuable thing to focus in on.
Yep, all great points. And I would just say, looking at the slide that's up there now, so we're seeing a screenshot of the engagement dashboards, all kinds of different visualizations that you can get on how your students are doing on all kinds of fancy metrics. And that's great, right? So that enables, as Rachel said, some really detailed and targeted interventions if you want to do them. But some of you all might be thinking, I'm not doing any of that yet, and this seems like a lot. This looks really complicated. That's okay, because you can start simply. You don't have to do everything that's on this dashboard. And very few people probably would have time to do everything on the dashboard, even though hopefully some of it is informative and can let you target some of your instruction. But there's plenty that you can do, as Rachel mentioned, that has a backing of learning science to improve student outcomes that doesn't require getting down into all that. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying you can start much more simply, because we know that the practice that students do causes better outcomes. That's the Doer Effect, right? More doing causes better outcomes. As an instructor, we can easily incentivize doing, right? Just as we talked about, whether we target that more by using data like shown in this dashboard, or whether we just do some simple things like, I'm going to give you a few participation points if you do the practice regularly that goes along in the course. So I would recommend that if you're not already into these fancy dashboards, if you are, great, but if you're not, just start simply. Do something simple like incentivize doing with some participation points, and that's something really easy that will pay off with studies that have been done that show that there's actually an effect there. You have a lot of agency, and it's easy to do things that learning science shows will get better outcomes. So if you're not doing these kind of things already, digging into the fancy dashboards, just start simply. You can get a benefit from doing that, and you can work your way up or not as you see fit and have time to do it.
So I think at this point we're 20 minutes in. If we want to take questions, anybody has anything else at the um, end of this?
So if we don't have any questions right now, maybe I'll ask one and just answer it to fill some time. So as courseware designers, what are we doing to take advantage of the Doer Effect? Right, we're not on the instructor side, but we are on the courseware design side. And at VitalSource, we're actually working on artificial intelligence algorithms to automatically generate courseware. So what we can do with that on our side is use the data that comes in from lots of students using the courseware to do things like find out which questions aren't performing as well in terms of helping students as well as they could, and we can replace those automatically. And we're going to do data-driven experimentation on how do you position the questions, what kinds of questions do you choose and where do you put them in order to maximize the Doer Effect. And so those are the kind of things that we're interested in. One of our areas of research is how do you do course design informed by data to get the most out of the Doer Effect. And so that's one area that we're really interested in and exciting about as we go. We're pretty well, as we said early in this, we've pretty well established that the Doer Effect is causal and it works in a variety of contexts. It's not just an artifact of a particular implementation that showed this. Sometimes the Doer Effect is larger than other times, but you pretty well always see it. And so given that, what are the factors on our end in course design that can maximize the Doer Effect, and how can we leverage student data to help us learn how to do that the best way?
So actually, Benny, it looks like we have a question from Jenna.
Okay, hi Jenna. So Jenna asked, does the size of the Doer Effect vary consistently based on the content or domain of the course? So the short answer is I'm not sure. So we have Doer Effect studies, say, or as you know, Jenna, in different business courses and different STEM courses. And I would say that it doesn't seem to vary based on the subject domain. Even though we don't have quite a large enough data set to say anything with much confidence there, I wouldn't say that it varies so much based on the subject matter, but I do suspect, again, based on limited data, that it can vary quite a lot based on features of the course design. So how often is the practice? Where is the practice placed? For example, there was a course where the way it was written was have really long pages, you read a ton, and then there are a few practice questions at the bottom, right? And we saw that just that aspect right there cause students to engage less with the practice. Just the questions are buried at the bottom of long pages that students were bailing out of. Well, the simplest thing we could say about the Doer Effect is that you can't get the Doer Effect if you don't do, right? So any aspects of course design that either promote or disincentivize doing the practice are going to have an effect on the amount of Doer Effect that you get. So I do think that course design features could have a lot to do with how big of a Doer Effect you get. It varies a lot. So sometimes the Doer Effect that you get on average, as Rachel said, it's about 6 times the effect of reading. But sometimes it can be well over 10. Sometimes it can be a little under 2, right? And so we see a large variation in the size of the Doer Effect that we've observed in our work and that Ken has observed in his work. And so there are factors that can push the Doer Effect around. And the optimistic way of looking at that is, all right, then if we can figure out what those factors are, we can push them in a direction that gets us the best learning. So yeah, as Jenna said, let's find out. That's something that we're going to be studying a lot in the future. Oh, another thing that's worth mentioning is that this is one of our particular ways of doing active learning. So active learning is a big umbrella, right? There's lots of things that could classify as active learning. This is the main way that we incorporate that. It's not the only way to do it. It's not the only way to do it to get better outcomes, but this is one way that has been studied and shown to cause better learning outcomes. And so that's a big reason why that we place so much emphasis on it in our work, that there's a lot of support to back it up, not just that, as we said at the start, that it goes along with better outcomes, just merely correlational, but it's actually causal. The clever statistical design that Ken came up with allows us to see that practice causes outcomes in a way that can't be, as Rachel mentioned, totally explained by a third variable like motivation. And so that's our brand of active learning. Just ask students practice questions as they go along to make sure that they get the most out of what they just read. Again, they can be simple comprehension questions. So in our efforts to automatically generate courseware with AI, we're not trying to generate the most complicated, difficult questions to answer that we can think up. And in fact, that might be all right for a few of the questions on a summative assessment, like a unit test or a quiz. But for practice, it's not what you want. We don't even know at first if the student can handle a question like that. If you were tutoring a student one-on-one, you wouldn't start out by asking them the craziest questions you could think of. You'd ask them basic stuff to make sure that they were getting it. And that's all that's necessary here for the Doer Effect. They don't have to be fancy questions. Again, we bias them towards being simple, straightforward comprehension type questions. It's a challenge to find out what material we should ask about and what's not something to ask about in an automated way. But we are making the majority of these questions low-level Blooms, like Blooms level 1 and 2, to make sure that you've just read, say, half a page, you get a question about it, so that you have to think about what you just read, and you can't just tune out, even unintentionally, skim over stuff, and before you know it, you've read a whole bunch but haven't gotten anything out of it. That's a lot of why the Doer Effect is so powerful. It prevents you from doing that, and just even that bit of engagement is more active, and as the research shows, contributes to much better outcomes than if you just simply read.
All right. Thanks everybody for, attending and popping in some comments and questions. We've really enjoyed it. Hopefully you've gotten something useful out of this this method.
Thanks, everybody.